The three pillars of the game, eh? Sure would be a shame if one of them was significantly bigger than the others, causing the entire structure to become less stable. Sup, Bunions, Chris Punking here with the new TTRPG rant for your viewing pleasure. Today, I want to talk about the three pillars of play. For those of you un-architecture related, the three pillars of D&D are the three different types of encounters that can exist in the game. These are social interaction, combat, and exploration. These categories are pretty broad, but every encounter does fall into one of the three pillars. These three types of encounters make up the game, and in a perfect world, I would now give some examples and be done with it. But unfortunately, the world we live in is not perfect, and our TTRPG system of choice is D&D 5e. And it has a problem. The combat pillar is too big. It is so big, in fact, that it undermines the other two pillars. Listen up, my Punion friends, for I shall prove to you why I believe combat to be the biggest pillar. I will explain the upsides of that as well as the downsides, and I will conclude by explaining why the downsides are so overpowering. Part 1. Why combat rules. I mean, come on. Out of the three core rulebooks, one of them is just monsters to fight. Monster stat blocks contain barely any information on how to better run them as exploration threats or as roleplay enemies. They just tell you how to fight them. Speaking of which, we have a fighter class, but not an explorer or a diplomat class. That alone is pretty telling on where the design and the gameplay focus lies. Additionally, while every class has combat abilities, not every class gets access to exploration abilities or social skills, because the general game design principle requires that everyone be able to participate in combat. The same cannot be said for the other pillars. Combat also has by far the most robust rule set out of any of the three pillars. I mean, you don't roll initiative when you start a conversation. What would a bonus action look like during a social interaction? I don't know, because the rules don't exist. Lastly, combat takes up the most time during play compared to the other types of encounters. You can spend several hours rolling to hit and damage against the same 4 trolls, while talking to the shopkeeper takes 15 minutes at best. Part 2. The upsides. This is where I get into the upsides of combat being the most important pillar, because despite the negative tone of this video, there are quite a few big ones. If any pillar were to be the biggest one, then it might as well be combat, because it has the best rules attached. In that regard, combat absolutely takes the cake, because the other pillars have no rules at all. Furthermore, the fact that in combat everyone gets to participate means that this is the only pillar where the party truly works together, unlike in social encounters, for instance, where usually the same party face character does all the talking. And finally, and arguably most importantly, combat is epic. Like, there's a reason people love action movies. The stakes are high, characters could die at any minute, and the fate of the world is at stake. Recreating this at your D&D table is what most players are there for, and so it would not make sense for any other pillar besides combat to have the number 1 spot. Part 3. Downsides. Yeah, combat drains the tension out of the other two pillars of play. Because no matter what happens, the worst thing that can happen is that combat ensues. Fail the stealth roll to sneak past some guards? Guess we just take them out. Fail to persuade the guards to let you pass? Well, guess we just start punching. This means characters must not be good at the other two pillars of play. As long as they are good at combat, they cannot be stopped. Their weaknesses in other pillars isn't that meaningful because the combat pillar is just so prevalent. This makes characters less interesting, in my opinion. If everyone is good at combat, then no one will be. Wow, I used that quote once already. Let's see if I can summon Syndrome like Beetlejuice next time I say it. Anyway, the fact that combat is so predominant and basically always the solution means that a character's power is solely reliant on their combat skills. And because the game assumes that everyone participates in combat, everyone gets combat powers and is assumed to use them. Making a character who sucks in combat in D&D is, well, not only is it basically impossible, but it's also heavily frowned upon by the community, which is whatever, I don't really care. But I would think that a legendary fighter could truly show his legendariness if he was not one in a party of 4 who are all equally as powerful as he is. Yes, I know, balance and blah blah blah, but that is what I mean when I say it makes characters less interesting. If we only have one scale against which we can judge a character's usefulness, all that means in a game that is balanced is that every character feels equally useful and no one gets to feel special anymore. Let me put it this way. Wouldn't it be far more interesting if charismatic characters were significantly weaker in combat? That way, they would have a clearly defined weakness and have to rely on their strong friends to protect them. Meanwhile, in social situations, the buff boys have the exact same weakness and need to be protected by the charisma chums. Your gut reaction to my statement is probably to say that I am wrong and that would be terrible. But I want you to examine those thoughts more closely and try to understand that, yes, I am wrong, but only in the context of our current game. Making a character that is useless in combat would suck to play because right now combat is all we're doing and all that matters. Being useful in other situations really is not a trade-off, because even if those situations result in failure, we can always just win the fight that follows and be fine. Let me ask you this. If you could double your effectiveness in exploration, but halve your power in combat, would you take that trade? No, of course not. At least not in our current iteration of the game. But the way combat is right now doesn't just make characters less interesting, it also makes the other two types of encounters less interesting. Because here's the thing. Combat might be the most exciting pillar with the highest stakes, but that is because if you fail the other two pillars, it leads to combat. And only if you fail combat is it actually a TPK, or something like that. Imagine the following. Your party is talking to a king, trying to convince him that one of his advisors is secretly evil. Here we have a robust rule set, where each party member can contribute to the encounter, though not all to the same extent. Some classes are just stronger than others. Things aren't going too well, and one of the party members suggests backing down and finding another way, but the party decides to continue. The party fails miserably. The king calls for their execution, guards swarm them, and they die. No initiative is rolled. They simply die. TPK by social encounter. Madness! What about player agency? As the guards swarm me, I want to pull out my sword and... No. The party failed an encounter disastrously, and that has consequences. Giving them a second chance after a colossal failure would ring hollow, in my opinion. Actions have consequences. It just so happens that most of the time, those consequences are just more actions. Bonus actions, if you will. I know your gut is probably turning right now because we have conditioned ourselves to think that combat will solve all of our problems. If all else fails, we can still enter initiative and fight our way out of this pickle we find ourselves in. But let me, for the sake of sport, contrast my above example with a different one. The party is fighting a lich and his right-hand man, a death knight. We have a robust rule set, and each party member can contribute, though not all to the same extent. Some classes are just stronger than others. Things are not going well, and one of the party members suggests backing down and finding another way, but they decide to continue. The party fails miserably. The lich reduces all of them to 0 hit points, and calls for his death knight to chop off their heads, while they lay beaten and defenseless on the ground. They don't get a chance to talk their way out of it. They simply die. TPK by combat encounter. Where is your cry for player agency now? If the pillars were truly equal, then this would be the exact same situation. Encounter, potential for retreat, catastrophic failure, death. No second chances. Actions have consequences. So what am I saying? Rocks fall your party over a failed deception roll? No, of course not. I mean, how unfair would that be? Not every class gets access to abilities that help during social encounters. There are no rules that allow each party member to impact the result of the encounter. The party phase messes up and the barbarian dies for it? No thank you. And I don't think you should TPK after just one failed encounter regardless of whether it's a combat or a social encounter. Failing forward is a philosophy I wholeheartedly describe to. In our throne room example, maybe the king simply takes the party into custody and they are arrested, and they get to make a daring prison escape. But the same could be said for our Lich Death Knight combat. The party is captured to be experimented on later. I just chose an extreme example that results in death to make a point. Please forgive me. That point, by the way, is that D&D is a fighting game first and foremost. And that is fine. Oh my god, I enjoy it as much as the next guy, trust me. But I would like more rules for other parts of the game. I want a rule set for exploration that involves the entire party and can fill an entire session, like combat. I want rule sets for social interaction that makes it easy to prep and run while being fun for everyone involved, like combat. And if we had that, I would want classes that excel at some of these, but not others. That way, a party could fill in each other's weaknesses, and each character could shine in the domain in which they are good at, while relying on the others for those where they are cheeks. I don't want to take your combat away. I want the other pillars to grow. If I want my players to escape from prison, why do I have to beat them senseless first? Why can I not put them there by cutscene after a failed social or exploration encounter? Players have been so conditioned that they can solve all of their problems with initiative and fireball, that I wager most of them would not accept it if you did that to them and call you the R-slur instead. By which I mean railroader. Railroader! Sorry, where was I? Oh yeah. 5e in its current state is just not the system for this type of gameplay. Even though I think people would want that. The MCDM RPG, for instance, has a negotiation system, aka rules for high-stakes social interactions. And while I hear the execution was a bit wonky, I also hear that many people welcomed the idea. Why do you think every D&D YouTuber has made a video on how to run travel? Because people want rules for other parts of the game besides combat. This does not change my problem about boring characters being just built for combat, but we take small steps here. Especially because I don't have any solutions myself. What do you want me to do? Rework all of D&D? Write my own RPG? I mean, I might do that. Okay. I was gonna use my outro today, but apparently in the time that it took me to get the camera set up, the damn thing expired. My outro expired. Can you imagine that? Must have been low quality to begin with. Probably best I never used the damn thing.